1st of September 1939.
This is the national programme from London. The first news, copyright reserved. These are today's main events. Germany has invaded Poland and has bombed many towns. Parliament was summoned for 6 o'clock this evening. Orders completing the mobilization of the Navy, Army and Air Force was signed by the King at a meeting this afternoon of the Privy Council. The British Cabinet met from 11:30 this morning until 1:30, and both Houses of Parliament were summoned for 6 o'clock this evening. President Roosevelt has appealed to the European powers that if they should be involved in hostilities, they should refrain from bombing civilians and unfortified towns.
The nightmare was about to become real. War with Germany seemed unavoidable, but surprisingly, London was the best prepared city in Europe. Surprisingly, because most people had refused to think much about war, nor had they made any preparations for the inevitable air raids it would bring. Throughout the 30s, men like Churchill had warned the public of the danger of Germany, that most people had ridiculed civil defense and supported appeasement. Yet quietly the government had laid its plans for the defense of the civilian population. In fact, it grossly overestimated the number of casualties. 600,000 dead were expected in the first wave of attacks. Now it was ready with millions of cardboard coffins and gas masks for the entire population. And on that very first day, a huge evacuation scheme went into action.
The evacuation of British children is going on smoothly and efficiently. The Ministry of Health says that great progress has been made with the first part of the government's arrangement.
It was crowds of children. We went from Stafford Road. It was terrible. Mothers crying and children crying. But we couldn't go with them. Once we left them outside like this place, we had to go away and leave them then. They never know, didn't know where they was going to or who they were going with.
I mean, you felt ever so sorry for the children. And the children didn't seem to realise actually what was happening to them. And we had to try to cheer them up the best way we could. Because their mothers and fathers, they wanted their mothers and crying.
I was the only one in that carriage that wasn't crying. Because I think as the train started off, it began to dawn on all these kids. They were being taken away from what to them was reality and going into the unknown. I think by the time we passed Basingstoke, I'd come to terms with the fact that this was a great adventure because suddenly there were no buildings. There were all fields with cows and things that were completely alien to me.
In 3 days, 600,000 were evacuated. London was childless. On the morning of Sunday, September the 3rd, it waited for the last seconds of Britain's ultimatum to Germany to tick away. At 11:15, Prime Minister Chamberlain spoke to the nation.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Within seconds, the sirens sounded. Suddenly, no one really knew what to do. Wardens ran down the streets giving conflicting orders. Cars were abandoned. People dived for shelters. Even gas rattles were sounded. For a few brief moments, confusion reigned. They were coming much more quickly than anyone expected. It was a false alarm. Officially, a Home Office misunderstanding. Someone, it seemed, had decided to test all the sirens, but hadn't got round to warning everybody else that it was going to happen. It was, in some ways, an apt beginning. That night, the pubs were packed. They'd survived one air raid warning. Perhaps they were all to be like that one. Preparations continued, but the bombers never came. The newsreels gave helpful tips about getting around in the blackout. Throughout the hours of darkness, no light must be visible outside, which meant everyone had to curtain their windows so that not the slightest chink of light got through. And there were air raid wardens on hand to see that the rules were obeyed. The theory was that enemy bombers wouldn't be able to find their way to London in the dark, but many motorists couldn't find their way either. There were 40 pedestrians killed on London's streets every day. By 1940, the fire service had become popularly known as the Darts team. Air raid wardens were thought officious and unnecessary, and people got angry with the government for frightening them all for nothing.
In fact, the warden service itself was getting rather fed up of the whole thing. They were wishing they could have the bombs so that people could realise that we weren't just taking them on, you see.
Johnny, have you got everything on board you ought to have?
Yes, I think so, Well,
thank goodness, that's something anyway.
I would like to stroll upon the prom, with the brass band playing tiddly hum.
Are you the fire brigade?
Fire brigade? Not all of it, no, there's some more in the yard. Why, what's the matter?
Quick, do come along, there's a house on fire.
Comedian Rob Wilton was funny because people didn't think him far wrong.
What address is it?
Grimshaw Street.
Grimshaw Street. Now, wait a minute. I know it as well as can be, and I can't just place it.
Oh, come along, it's only just down there.
No, don't tell me. Let me think of it for myself. Grimshaw. Oh, isn't that annoying? I could walk straight to it, and I can't think of it.
It's next to Whiteley Street.
Next to Whiteley Street. Oh, I know it as well as can be. Grimshaw. What's the number, lady? What number is it?
78.
78. Turned out nice again today, hasn't it?
Here is a short news bulletin. The German army invaded Holland and Belgium early this morning by land and by landings from parachutes. The necessary measures for giving assistance were put into effect at once.
On May the 10th, 1940, Hitler suddenly attacked Holland and Belgium without warning and crashed through their feeble defences.
In the light of this morning's events in Holland and Belgium, householders are recommended to overhaul their domestic preparations against the possibility of air attack in their own districts. It is emphasized that tube stations in London are not available as air raid shelters.
The situation rapidly deteriorated into disaster. The French and British armies were driven back. After only 3 weeks fighting, the British were improvising a hurried escape across the Channel from Dunkirk, while France was on the verge of total collapse. In London, with the German army only a few miles away across the Channel, Churchill, now Prime Minister, broadcast to the nation.
Should the invader come to Britain, there will be no placid lying down of the people in submission before him, as we have seen, alas, in other countries. We shall defend every village, every town, and every city. The vast mass of London itself, fought street by street, could easily devour an entire hostile army, and we would rather see London laid in ruins and ashes than that it should be tamely and abjectly enslaved.
Invasion was expected at any moment. Fire watchers looked up for parachutists, not down for fires. Parks and open spaces were littered with trenches and obstacles to prevent the landing of enemy planes and gliders. And high above, the Battle of Britain raged. But London was still untouched. Then came Saturday, September the 7th, 1940. 5 o'clock in the afternoon. In retaliation for an RAF raid on Berlin, 320 German bombers pounded the Dockland area. The terraced houses went down like packs of cards. The raid had lasted 2 hours. The people were dazed and confused. The authorities seemed powerless. And now people started to run. They collected together what belongings they could and got out. Entire families escaped westwards. Handcarts, prams, bicycles, piled with pans, bedding, valuables. That evening, the fires of Dockland were still blazing, a beacon for a new wave of enemy bombers. From 8 in the morning till 4 the next morning, 250 bombers passed overhead. In many places, the civil defense couldn't cope. In the darkness, terror was added to chaos in the narrow streets by the river. Morning showed the full extent of the devastation. 1,000 Londoners had been killed, whole tracts of the East End had been reduced to rubble, no enemy planes had been shot down. There was anger and despair. Rumours spread that West Ham was ready to surrender. The authorities had prepared for the wrong things. There were millions of coffins, but no homes for the homeless. There were thousands of empty hospital beds for serious casualties, but no adequate provision for the walking wounded. It had been forecast that one bombed house would mean 4 dead people. A neat government statistic, and they had organised accordingly. On the morning of September the 8th, 1940, there were 1,000 dead, but there were many more thousands of homeless, shocked but alive, and with nowhere to go. Schools were opened as rest centres. They were neither suitable nor prepared, but they were the only places big enough. Very soon, 25,000 people were living in them.
Can I have your name?
Albert Vickery.
Albert Vickery. Is this your wife?
Yes.
And what's happened to your house?
My home's been bombed out, you see, and I want to take my wife and children down the country to my sister's.
Last night, lady, my house was bombed.
Yes.
And all the things were gone. And I didn't know what to do.
That morning, and in the days that followed, people improvised and helped each other. As the official departments struggled with problems often quite beyond them, fear began to turn to anger. The East End started to think about how to get something done.
It was those of us who had a realisation, however faint, that the worst was yet to come. We made the noise. We harassed the local authorities.
You wanted to be safe, you didn't know what to do.
Churchill came down. It was not an extensive visit, but he came down and visited the scene of devastation, and his comment was that he could not understand the threat of the people to march on Whitehall. There seemed to be less disorder amongst the people than there was amongst the authorities.
Churchill could defy Hitler, but not London. The government set up a committee to assess morale. Tom Hopkinson, editor of Picture Post, was a member.
The committee sat for about 6 months, but at the end of that time, my own opinion given was that morale was perfectly okay. There was nothing to worry about. Ordinary people were not going to crack or give up or say, it's chuck in their hand and say, I'm not working in this aircraft factory anymore because it well, it's too dangerous or we're not going to win the war or something. I said the only useful morale committee I can think of would be one that kept watch on some of the ministers in the government, not one that reported to ministers in the government.
100 miles away on the other side of the Channel, Goering hoped to win the war at one stroke. London would collapse under the weight of his bombing. He would avenge the few feeble but provocative attacks Churchill had ordered the RAF to make on Berlin. But in bombing London, the Luftwaffe turned away from attacking the vital RAF fighter fields in southern England. Those attacks had almost crippled fighter command, but now it was reprieved and was soon shooting the Luftwaffe out of the sky in ever-increasing numbers. One German pilot flew off course to bomb Buckingham Palace. The daring raid didn't kill the king, but succeeded in uniting the city in a way a government could never have done.
The king is still in London, in London, in London, and he would be in London town if London Bridge was falling down. He's got a house in London, in London, in London, and there within the palace yard the soldiers of the king stand guard. Strike up the music, roll up the drums, and let all the trumpets play. Tell all the world we're facing the music. Here we all are, and here we all stay. The king is still in London, in London, in London. Like Mr. Jones and Mr. Brown, the king is still in town.
Daylight raids were becoming too expensive, so the Germans now came at night, every night. The routine was always the same. The inevitable drone, inevitable bombs, and nothing to fight back with. The fighter planes were no good at night. But Churchill ordered up all the available anti-aircraft guns for the defence of London. On September the 12th, they opened fire. Churchill knew that this roaring cannonade, as he called it, could do little harm to the enemy. The gunners shot down only 4 planes, and the shrapnel from the shells probably killed more people on the ground than in the air. But it didn't matter. People at last believed they were fighting back. The Blitz was settling into a ritual.
BBC Home Service, up in the morning early. This time, the physical exercises for ladies.
Regularity meant familiarity. Chin up, grin, and bear it.
Good morning, everyone. Will you get your chair and stand with your left side towards the back of it and your left hand on it? Now swing your right leg across in front of your left one so that it comes as high as you can get it. Both knees straight. Now let it swing down towards...
The eerie silence of deserted streets closed by an unexploded bomb, but the day didn't stop. The normal life of the capital simply flowed round it. By afternoon, people were queuing up for the shelters again. They trekked across London for a place in a deep tube in the West End. It became a routine, and that was important. It meant people were learning to cope, coming to terms with the extraordinary idea that every night someone was trying to blow them to kingdom come. Yet more than half of the people of London were still sleeping at home, and the official air raid shelters, complete with proper bunks, were almost empty. People even felt comfortable down there. A common danger and a shared routine broke down barriers. The Blitz, for many people, became one of the best times of their lives.
Hello, Miss. Good evening.
I think that'll be all right now.
Yes, that's grand.
Anyway, I'll be back in a few minutes if you want.
Now, how are we going to get you up there?
London was an exciting place to be. Theatres and dance halls were open. You could have a good time. People worked hard and played hard. Who knew how long it would last? You're a long time dead. Prostitutes stood under the business-as-usual signs, and people poured in at night to share the exhilaration of being in a city under fire. Many felt they were fighting not only against a common danger, but for an ideal.
Let us pray. O God, we commit ourselves into thy keeping this night. We pray thee to bless all those who are keeping us safe. For Christ's sake.
For the defenders too, life had settled into a pattern. Tonight would be a test of nerve and skill, and would bring body-shattering tiredness, very much like last night. While the battle of fire and bombs raged outside, the battle of fear and courage went on inside. People sheltered where they felt safest. At the beginning, that was mainly in the basements of warehouses, under railway arches, or in makeshift sheds of their own. It was the familiarity and good company that made them feel safe, and it was there that they died.
From September onwards, there were two real sources of shelter for the populace that weren't being used. There were the basements of many big businesses, and very big tall buildings were the safest, because when they were bombed, they didn't come crashing down. They had a steel framework. So when they were bombed, a bit would be knocked off the top, but the basement was very safe. So we wanted the basements of businesses opened up, and of course we wanted the tubes to be used for shelters. And on that we finally carried the day. The government was obliged to open the tube shelters.
The tube stations became a home from home for tens of thousands, but the best place to be was in a big private shelter like those under the Dorchester or the Savoy, where each guest had his own marked mattress and his meals served in bed. The majority, of course, couldn't go there. The breakdown of class barriers didn't extend that far, although people from the East End marched on the Savoy to demand admission. In the tubes, the trains not only woke you up, they became mobile canteens, and throughout the night, welfare officers and the WVS brought tea and comfort to those who needed it. The Blitz was the last occasion when the middle classes were able to offer charity to the working classes and be readily accepted, and they did it with a courage and enthusiasm which probably did as much to save London as the courage of the Cockneys themselves.
I remember one particular shelter where we had a great deal of trouble, night after night. It was a sort of shelter where, if one child hit another child, out came a knife, you know, the sort of thing. And eventually, we solved it by finding someone who was head of a gang in that area. We knew that everyone was frightened of this gang, so we got the wife, who was a very big, sturdy woman, and she was made shelter warden, and we had no more trouble at all.
And on the platform, when you couldn't get inside the shelter, like the underground, you'd lay on the platform. I bet you didn't have no room to move at all. You couldn't walk round each other, you know. It was ever so crowded.
London people aren't awfully fond of ventilation, or they weren't in those days. And you would go down to the shelter, perhaps, as we very often did. 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you'd find all the ventilators open, everything quite as it should be. And if you went down there at 1 o'clock in the morning, every ventilator would be stuffed up with rags, and you'd have to pull them all out again, because they liked a good fug. And they certainly got it in some of them.
Dirty people somewhere. You tried to get where the clean people were, you know, if your own safety for the kiddies, you know.
They were extraordinarily healthy. And that's just one of those acts of God, I am absolutely convinced. Because if ever there were conditions through which an epidemic could start, it was there. And yet it never did.
London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights. Each night, over 200 bombers dropped more than 200 tons of bombs. 14,000 tons of high explosive hit the city.
Some people I knew gave a lift to a couple in a car who'd lost their home, and they were taking them to relations in the country. And the man who was driving the car said to them, "Was it your own house?" And the woman said, no, the man said, "Yes." But the woman nudged him and said, "No, dear, would have been Monday. When you think of the instalments and instalments that they'd paid, that there they were, perfectly cheerful, driving away, and just said would have been Monday.
And we walked through the tunnel from Liverpool Street to the Bank Station. And when I got there, I felt like turning back. There was nothing else but bodies. Well, it's hard to describe. It was just like tailor's dummies put up against the wall. Some with no clothes on, some with half their clothes on. And we had to tear the toilets, they were like plywood sheets with the sanitary pails inside. We had to tear them down to use them as stretchers.
The poor at the home, you'd think, and the more, remember the 1930s, before the war, had been heartbreaking for Deptford. I mean, long lines of unemployed. They'd got so little, you'd have thought. Yet when the time came, they had the courage of lions.
It was like one big family during the Blitz. If you got bombed out, the person next door took you in, and that's how it went.
From November onwards, the bombers did not come every night. That was a relief. In any case, neither Hitler nor his Luftwaffe could stop children and shopkeepers making the best of Christmas. If the shops couldn't sell model aeroplanes for kids then, they never would. But there shouldn't have been any children in London to enjoy a Blitz Christmas. They should have been evacuated away from the danger. But that wasn't the authorities' fault. They'd been sent, but they drifted back. Families wanted to be together despite the danger. There was 250,000 children in London for Christmas 1940. Loss of sleep was a major problem. Many people who did a full-time job in the day and a voluntary one at night went through much of the war on 3 or 4 hours sleep a night. Others paid for a good night's rest. There was no shortage of private firms ready and willing to cash in on the fears and exhaustion of their countrymen. For a few shillings you could buy your piece in Epping Forest and join the already resident campers who spent the whole war there, or even spend the weekend in Torquay. It was preferable to paying a wide boy sixpence to keep you a place in the shelters.
The moon that lingered over London town, poor puzzled moon, he wore a frown. How could he know we two were
A new phrase entered the language, bomber's moon. For the first time in centuries, the Londoner was as conscious of the weather as the countryman.
Paved with stars, it was such a romantic affair. And as we kissed and said goodnight, a nightingale sang our
On the 29th of December 1940, the city burnt down in the second Great Fire of London. Bombs shattered the water mains and the fire hoses ran dry. But the fire should never have happened at all. The raid was a comparatively small one, but it was the Sunday after Christmas, fire watchers were taking time off, and many premises were locked. Customs officers even prevented firemen from entering one blazing warehouse because they didn't have the necessary authorization. Surrounded by fire, the most vulnerable building of all still stood, St. Paul's. It was a symbol of defiance. It had been hit by dozens of firebombs, but had been saved by its own efficient fire team. The moral was obvious, and it was rubbed in by Herbert Morrison, the Home Secretary.
Some of you lately, in more cities than one, have failed your country. This must never happen again.
Fire watching was made compulsory. The government had believed that the British would resist the idea of compulsion, but no one complained. Instead, they just dodged it. 3/4 of those registered claimed exemption. In contrast, the bus drivers and conductors continued to operate their services whatever the conditions. The familiar red buses became as much a symbol of London's survival and resistance as St. Paul's. By 1941, the authorities and people had learned to live with the Blitz. Bombing didn't disorganize life, nor air raids stop production. At first, everything had come to a halt when the sirens sounded, and the disruption had often been more costly than the damage caused by the raid. Later, with spotters on the roof, factories carried on until the last minute.
Hello, gunfire in the southeast. Right.
And the idea of business as usual until the last possible moment didn't just apply to factories involved in war production, but to shops and ordinary people as well.
Sirens have sounded, but we are carrying on. Those who'd wish to do so may take shelter in the basement. Alarm bells will be rung if our roof spotters report that danger threatens, when all floors must be cleared at once. Carry on.
People proved their adaptability in a remarkable way. Far from running mad in the streets as forecast, they seemed to be taking the bombardment in their stride. There was no increase in mental disorder. Indeed, the suicide rate actually fell.
When the Blitz was on, life was very easy because you had only two things you were thinking about. Where do I get something to eat? Where do I sleep? And that does simplify life most marvelously.
By the spring of 1941, with fighter radar and improved ground control, the RAF seemed to be winning the night battle. But on May the 10th, the German bombers came in strength.
OC speaking. Right. That was Home Office Fire Control. They'll be raiding tonight.
London's fire chief summoned 1,000 extra fire pumps into the city from all over the country. In the fighter control rooms, the radar plots were showing hundreds of bombers converging on London. The controller scrambled his night fighters into the dark to meet them. Over the city, the first flares and firebombs started to fall.
OP control, 36 OP. Incendiary bombs falling between 145 degrees and 180 degrees, about 3/4 of a mile.
It was the classic pattern. First mark the target and start the blaze with incendiaries, then spread the flames and hamper the firefighting with high explosives.
Control. Right. Fire at Dock Street, sub. Individual homes had a low priority for the firefighters, but it was hard for ordinary people to understand this strategy. In Brixton, angry citizens blocked the path of engines racing past their burning homes to other fires. The whole city, north and south of the river, seemed one continuous roaring fire. By midnight, 2,000 fires were out of control. Sub, only 66 pumps available.
Right, get on to brigade control. Call still being received. Further help required. Pumps available, 66.
Can you hear me? Checking your pumps available.
10 pumps, thank you.
10, thank you. 10 pumps available.
At 2 in the morning, the water pressure dropped. Over 600 mains had been smashed.
Come out the float there! She's finished!
There was nothing to be done. 1,436 dead, 2,000 seriously injured, £20 million worth of damage, 8,000 streets, one-third of London, impassable, 5,500 houses demolished, 12,000 people homeless, 700 acres completely consumed by fire. Sunday morning, and the city filled with sightseers. While some queued for death certificates, others looted the damaged shops and pubs. 150,000 families were without water, gas or electricity. Half the main telephone system was destroyed. 2 more nights like that, and London would be finished. The House of Commons was completely gutted, and in the night firemen complained that they were refused entry because they didn't enjoy parliamentary privilege, and the fire chief had been shot at by the Home Guard in the Mall. Churchill wept when he saw the ruins. Luckily for London, Hitler was about to attack Russia, and his bombers were called away to the east. For a while, London could rest and regain her strength. Myra Hess gave midday concerts in the National Gallery. Grey, wartime London screwed itself down to the long, hard haul which was to take Britain from avoiding defeat to achieving victory. It was the era of war work and music while you work, tanks for Russia, planes for Berlin, ammunition for the Second Front. It was the period of austerity, Warship Week followed by Waste Paper Month, smaller rations, longer queues. A time when it seemed the war would last forever. By 1942, the Americans were in the war and London seemed like an international barracks. It was a girl's paradise. Resentful Englishmen summed up the trouble with Americans. They were overpaid, overfed, oversexed, and overhere.
Oh, Johnny, how you can love. Oh, Johnny, heaven above. You make my sad heart jump with joy. And when you're near, I just can't sit still a minute. I'm so, oh, Johnny, please tell me, dear, what makes me love you so? You're not handsome, it's true, but when I look at you, I want to, oh, Johnny,
Communique number 1. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
June the 6th, 1944. D-Day. We were back in Europe. Now it must only be a matter of weeks until the end. But then, only 1 week later, on June the 13th, London was back in the front line facing the grimmest ordeal of all. It was the first of the Germans' secret weapons.
When they sound the last all clear, how happy my darling will be.
With these relatively cheap, pilotless aerial torpedoes, Hitler planned to knock out London and win the war. They were more devastating than anything the city had previously suffered, and each carried a ton of high explosive. After almost 5 years of war, the enthusiasm and high morale of the earlier Blitz was missing. The V1, this new inhuman terror, was something that many exhausted Londoners had no longer the resources to meet. In 5 weeks, 1.5 million were evacuated, more than twice the number who went in the Great Evacuation of 1939. The defenders were bewildered. The civilians could do nothing but watch and wait. In mid-July, the government ordered the removal of all the city's anti-aircraft guns to a narrow belt of the south coast. The gunners could now pick out their targets as they came in, without worrying about their unexploded shells falling on civilians, and fighters could tackle anything that got past the barrage. The fighters had also mastered techniques for shooting them down. Although doodlebugs couldn't fire back, attacking them could be hazardous. Soon, 80% were being destroyed. On September the 7th, the government was able to announce to a relieved city, the Battle of London is over. The day after that announcement, London was rocked by a huge, mysterious explosion. It was Hitler's most destructive weapon, the V-2 rocket. There was no defense against it and no warning that it was coming. Plans were laid to abandon London.
I was leaving Stratford about 12:25 to finish at Canning Town. And I got to a pub called the Telegraph at the corner of Giff Lane, just past Old West Ham Church. And there was a terrific crash, huge cloud of dust, couldn't see much. Now, where those rockets was concerned, they were terrible things. Because with the buzz bombs, you could see them, you could hear them. There was a certain amount of direction where they were going to go, but with a rocket, it was there. You'd never had a chance.
It was the forerunner of today's intercontinental ballistic missile. If Hitler had been able to bring them into use earlier, they might have brought him victory. But the advancing Allied armies overran the launching sites, and the last rocket fell on London on the 27th of March 1945, only 5 weeks before the end of the war. Bombs and rockets and fire had killed almost 30,000 Londoners and injured more than 130,000.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. But in the interest of saving lives, the ceasefire began yesterday to be sounded along all the fronts. The German war is therefore at an end.
They'd always said we can take it. But it had become a kind of desperate, we can take it. We were tired, oh God, how tired we were. And exhausted.